Hello and welcome back as we're nearing the end of our look at the AP US History curriculum for Era 6. In this video, we'll be looking at topic 6.12, Controversies over the Role of Government in the Economy, especially in the Gilded Age. This time, we will be looking at significant changes over time regarding the role of the government in the economy, but also what stayed the same. So let's get to it. Debates over the role of the U.S. government in the economy was not anything new. Dating back to the Constitutional Convention, the powers of the federal government were issues of debates and later were the source of division between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Those debates intensified in the aftermath of the War of 1812 with the introduction of Henry Clay's American system, which included the ever-divisive use of protective tariffs. As the U.S. increasingly industrialized and big businesses came to dominate the economic landscape in the United States, various groups began to call for increased government involvement of the federal government in the economy. Farmers' alliances and the Granger movement demanded regulation of railroad corporations and the banking system. Unions sought various protections for industrial workers, including the right to bargain collectively. Developing out of what was the populist movement in the 1890s that blended the interests of both farmers and laborers, they adopted a platform calling for the free coinage of silver, the abolition of national banks, a sub-treasury scheme or some similar system, a graduated income tax, plenty of paper money, government ownership of all forms of transportation and communication, the direct election of senators, non-ownership of land by foreigners, civil service reform, the working day lasting just 8 hours, postal banks, pensions, review of the law of contracts, and reform of immigration regulations. William Jennings Bryan, a former congressman, propelled himself into the Democratic nomination during the election of 1896 with his Cross of Gold speech, which called for a reform of the monetary system and attacked business leaders as the cause of an ongoing economic depression. He believed that bimetallism, or free silver, would bring economic prosperity, especially to farmers and labor interests, in effect seizing on the main ideas that had been supported by the Populist Party. But many of the leading industrialists didn't want government regulation, since that could interfere with their quest to build monopolies and increase their profits. Many leading politicians supported the idea of laissez-faire policies towards the economy, meaning hands-off. In other words, allowing the market itself to dictate what prices and policies businesses would follow. This idea was really nothing new, as it dated at least to the argument put forth by Adam Smith in his work Wealth of Nations, published back in 1776. He supported the idea of division of labor, believing it increased production, and even attacked government restrictions that he believed hindered industrial expansion, which, of course, the Gilded Age industrialists totally loved. Essentially, he supported the idea that the market should be guided by the motive for profit, and that the government should not interfere. The problem with this line of thinking, as it was applied to the Gilded Age, was that Smith also believed that in order to have a healthy economy, there needed to be competition. But with so much consolidation during the Gilded Age, there were entire industries that had virtually no competition at all. Like Rockefeller and Standard Oil controlling 95% of the oil refining process. Here's just one example for you. This lack of competition often made economic downturns worse when they did happen, and they were inevitable. In 1893, overspeculation in railroads combined with a stock market crash then added to the problem of falling wheat prices, a credit crisis caused by people withdrawing their money from banks who were possibly on the verge of going out of business, and the Treasury running out of gold in order to exchange paper notes and bonds for that gold. And this plunged the country into a severe recession. President Grover Cleveland was actually even forced to borrow $65 million in gold from J.P. Morgan and the Rothschild banking family in England, just so the U.S. government could meet its obligations. In this panic alone, a total of over 15,000 companies and 500 banks, many of them in the western part of the United States, failed. An estimated 20% of the nation's workforce was unemployed as a result. Some areas were even more hard hit, with localized unemployment reaching as high as 43% in places like Michigan. This huge spike in unemployment, combined with the loss of life savings kept in failed banks, and there's no security for that like there is now, but this meant that a once secure middle class could not meet their mortgage obligations, and so many people lost their homes as well. The government did very little to assist in panics such as these, clinging to laissez-faire policies, though there were some half-hearted attempts at regulations. In response to state attempts to regulate railroads, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act, which outright prohibited states from doing so, and created an Interstate Commerce Commission to formally oversee interstate trade. But it was very underfunded and so had very little actual power. There were also continued attempts to provide protection to American industry through the use of the tariff, but generally the tariff levels were kept very high, reaching as high as 50% with the passage of the McKinley Tariff in 1890, which caused steep increases in prices for goods and services and gave little incentive to American companies to improve efficiency to lower prices for the consumer. The tariff would be a major influence on the political battles in Congress, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in our next topic video. Mostly, the government only intervened in the economy if the government was to receive direct benefits from that intervention. Continuing this theme of government involvement, if it benefits them, we see the U.S. government beginning to support the idea of overseas expansion. Now, much of this will be covered in our next time period, but there are a few things that apply here into the Gilded Age, particularly towards the economy. Many European countries had been embarking on a new round of imperialism, in particular focusing on gaining control of and influence in Africa and Asia. They generally sought to do so because they were looking for new markets to sell their products, as well as new sources of raw materials for their industrial production. America was in particular need of markets, as the ability of the United States to create products far exceeded domestic demand. A perfect example of this economic motivation for expansion involves the case of Hawaii. Sugar and pineapple planters had begun purchasing land there in the mid-19th century, in particular the Dole family, and made tremendous profits from that prime growing area. Numerous individuals, both in the U.S. and white planters in Hawaii, began discussing about the possibility of the United States annexing Hawaii because tariffs applied for goods coming from Hawaii, but if it was part of the U.S., that would no longer be true. When Queen Liliuokalani came to power in 1891, she attempted to increase the power of the monarchy and reduce the power of the local legislature, which at the time was dominated by Euro-American business elites, with the goal of ultimately placing more power back into the hands of the native Hawaiians. Now, this could have potentially interfered with the goal of adding Hawaii to the U.S., so a revolt was then orchestrated by these white plantation owners, mostly Americans, as well as some missionaries, in order to overthrow her in 1893. Initially, President Grover Cleveland rejected annexing Hawaii, leaving Hawaii to govern itself as an independent republic, and therefore still subject to the tariff, at least until somewhere in the middle of the Spanish-American War in 1898. But again, that's more for our next unit. Well, that about covers what you need to know for topic 6.12, Controversies over the Role of Government in the Gilded Age. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.